Now it's my pleasure to introduce your presenter today, Peyton Marshall. Since 1985, Peyton Marshall has served in product management, sales, and senior management roles in a number of B2B sectors. For 12 years, he was an investment banker, most of that time at Goldman Sachs, structuring and selling complex and innovative financial solutions to global corporate and financial institution CFOs. Since 1997, he has been on the receiving end of all kinds of sales approaches as CFO of 3 public biotech companies, CEO of 1 public biotech company, and COO of a private drug discovery company. He has been CEO and chairman of a private cloud software company since 2012. So with that, Peyton, welcome.
Thank you, Taylor, and thank you everyone for joining. I know it's a busy time of year for most commercial teams, but also not a bad time of year to pause and reflect about what really matters for your commercial team. And in all the revenue targeting and the profitability thoughts and the cost cutting and the budgeting, what really matters is your customer. We're already in the era of buyer empowerment, as buyers have had technology to support them, perhaps even creating advantages as they have information at their fingertips. But we're now entering the era of buyer enablement, a big theme at the Gartner CEB conference this year, where enterprises have the technology and tools to transcend conventional selling. In the best B2B enterprises, buyer enablement is reflected in pivotal initiatives. For marketing, it's all about connecting with customers digitally through account-based marketing. In sales, the big theme is insights for impactful customer conversations. And in the variety of functions that range from pricing through to finance, often this is housed in product management. It's often about account-specific pricing and the strategies that can be used for account-specific pricing to increase profits. Let's turn to account-based marketing. HubSpot defines account-based marketing as using digital technology to deliver targeted, personalized content, where that content is helpful, specific, and relevant. And it's interesting, if you haven't seen the 2018 State of Account-Based Marketing from Demand Gen, they have a number of statistics that they cite, where 93% of their respondents said that ABM is extremely or very important to their overall organizational success, where 75% of their practitioners have only had an ABM strategy in place for less than a year. Yet it's interesting, as those surveys have taken place, to see that 89% saw an improvement in conversion rates for ABM accounts versus non-ABM accounts. And 91% saw a higher average deal size for ABM accounts. But we can step beyond ABM to ABS, account-based selling. And despite maybe what you see as the messages from Microsoft and LinkedIn, account-based selling is more than just knowing who your customer is, where they went to school, where they've worked before. It's really digital technology to support targeted, personalized customer conversations. So like account-based marketing, that content needs to be helpful, specific, and relevant, but it's about customer conversations. And those are easier than one-way online interactions. They need to be robust so that salespeople can be effective in their direct customer conversations. So if we look at those functions and those functions focused on their customers, the best B2B enterprises unite and align their commercial teams. And they do that with shared customer-centric content and tools. The most powerful of those tools is a value proposition. Now, everyone talks about a value proposition, but there's actually some question about what it is, because value propositions mean different things to different people. Sometimes they're an image or even a vision or a visual. Often they're bulleted or verbal summaries of what you do. And they sometimes go to quantitative analysis, mathematical analysis, and financial analysis to demonstrate your advantage and why buy. But at its most fundamental level, a value proposition answers the central question, what do we do for our customers? Value propositions are about turning product monologues about features into customer-centric conversations about benefits and value. Value propositions are fundamentally critical buyer enablement content because great value propositions provide clear answers to simple questions. What are the 3 things that make you better than the alternative? How much better are you? And what is that worth to the customer? Value propositions support buyer enablement in collaboration, where sales teams partner with their buyers. Good value propositions provide options. Keeping conversations simple and direct is important. Why go deeper than a customer needs to go? And there are 3 layers of value. One is qualitative. Our solution, for example, is more energy efficient. One is quantitative. Our solution reduces energy consumption by 35%. And the last layer is financial. For that facility, we reduced energy costs by $4.2 million per year, or this many euros per year. And all 3 of those layers are critical. The best value propositions facilitate conversations at all levels and going only as deep as you need to go. Value propositions are great content for buyer-centric sales conversations through a buying process. And buyers typically early on are identifying and prioritizing before they evaluate, and they're evaluating before they decide and purchase. And often in the first stages, it's hard for sales to actually have content and interaction. So in the form of a flexible case study, a value proposition is useful then to really help sales early on connect, qualify. It's an elevator pitch. It's about differentiating. It's getting the buyer to decide to evaluate and advance to the next stage. Because with increasingly complex solutions, that critical center stage of evaluation can get into a deeper customer value analysis. And that's often a team effort where sales and pre-sales professionals together are involved in interactions with buyer teams where they're really about credentializing. They need to engage their buyer audience and they need to engage their buyer stakeholders, because that's the period when they're really out to customize how their solution fits that buyer, as well as prove it. And the aim for that critical evaluation phase is to come out at the end with a shared business case to buy with a sponsor or a program manager. Because at that stage, for sales at least, you're going back into this period of uncertainty where procurement, legal, IT, other functions get involved. And a shared business case to buy at that time helps drive time to close, helps connect with the purchasing process, and provides the fundamental basis for a good negotiation. B2B value propositions are customer-centric, but it's not just about being customer-centric. In our May webinar, we really went through in greater detail the whole process and buying process and how value props are used. But in today's webinar, we really want to focus on value propositions as being customer-specific. So value propositions are specific by account. That is, there are a number of relevant specific differences among your buyer accounts. And it's useful to think of those differences in 3 broad buckets. First, there's the underlying identity and business of the account. Second, there are the problems and objectives of the account. And often in the problems and objectives, that's where you get differences among stakeholders within accounts. And then clearly different accounts are making different decisions. So let's look a little bit more specifically at what some of those differences can be. So by identity and business, there can be differences in business line and business positioning. What vertical are they in? Is the content that you have, are the examples of how you've helped another customer directly relevant to their business? There are geographical differences, and sometimes that's as simple as currency. Often it's within a currency area, very different market benchmarks. There's a difference in Greek wage rates from German wage rates, even though everyone's in euros. And then finally, there can be geographical conditions, as in crop protection products, where Northern California growers may be different from Southern California growers. There are differences in operating practices, where for some customers, they may be doing things today in-house, others may be outsourced. They may be vertically integrated, or they may be quite separate from the downstream link in their own value chain. And then clearly there are differences among accounts in their own scale and their own operating metrics. Problems and objectives. On one side, on the problems or on the pain points, some companies may be more sensitive to their costs, underlying profitability. Other companies may be more sensitive to revenue increases. Specific stakeholders may be very sensitive to managing specific risks. And where there are problems and pain points, sometimes the flip side of that are direct objectives and goals, where, for example, individuals and accounts may have sales targets, another individual may have a margin target, a corporate entity may have a sustainability target. And knowing and understanding which of these problems and objectives are most important, identifying what resonates best, is really what sales is trying to do in moving a deal process forward. Finally, there are decisions. And clearly, with software, with diagnostics, with testing equipment, with many kinds of solutions, there are different applications and use cases for your solution. And you'll want to have different conversations depending on what the specific use case is that your customer is most interested in or wants to start with. There are timing and organizational differences in how decisions are made and how implementation is undertaken. There are reference alternative differences. And by that, what I mean is some of your customers at some points in the sales cycle may actually be looking at whether they change at all. Their reference alternative then is the status quo. How do they do things today? At other stages, they may be looking at more direct comparisons versus a specific competitor. And all of those reference alternatives or competitors are things that you need to think about, because you really need to frame your conversation in terms of the decision that the customer's making. You enable that customer if you look at their underlying decision process. And finally, increasingly, offerings are complex. And so helping guide a buyer through choices among your offerings, helping them think about the right customization for them, helping them understand how value might contribute to that is important. So there are relevant specific differences among buyer accounts. Value propositions, though, also need to be structured so that they're specific to buyer stakeholders. And there are really two dimensions in thinking about your stakeholders. The first is the functional difference. That is, different functional stakeholders speak different languages. If you think, for example, if you're calling on someone from finance, they speak the language of ROI, TCO. They speak in accounting terms. They want to know impacts by year. They think about timelines. When you're talking to sales, you know you're talking to someone who cares about the top line. And so revenue orientation, annual sales, sales relative to targets, those are all things that matter. You're probably just speaking to someone who's a little bit more instinctive, may have a short attention span. On the marketing side, you're really more into project managers who are usually better at process management, better at detail. They, again, have a top-line orientation, and so those sorts of metrics are what matter to them. On the product management side, we're starting to get into the technical part of your buyer, where analytical approaches, technical language may be interesting, but where their operating metrics may be more front and center. And speaking the language of those operating metrics, whether they're production line metrics or throughput metrics, are what's important. That's not too far from your product development people who are there earlier in the cycle, where product development people at a target buyer are probably into their own timelines. They're technical as well. They're concerned with speed and likelihood of success. Manufacturing and service delivery is pretty broad. Again, you may have technical people here, and operating metrics really matter. So on the manufacturing side, it might be per part that they manufacture. In healthcare, it's per patient. And their service delivery of a highly sophisticated nature. At a call center, it might be a metric of per call. As we then get into the more process-oriented parts of your customer, we know what procurement people are looking at. They're looking at your price, but more directly, they may be looking at some other costs as well, and making sure that you can cover that with them, that you can help them understand that broader cost context helps. But what also helps is the indirect influence in working with sponsors as they work with their own procurement professionals. Similar kinds of politics apply when you get to QA, IT, and legal. Here, it may be a little bit less cost and a little bit more about risk and risk management. And finally, in the C-suite, you know you have kind of the broader vision, you know the broader financial results matter, and you know the attention span's very short. So as you look at how to structure good content that addresses those stakeholders, one of the universal ways and universal languages to bring all this together is really about talking about your dollarized or euroized quantified value. But value propositions also should be thought of in terms of being specific by stakeholder, because different stakeholders, regardless of where they come from functionally, play different roles in the buying process. We know we're all looking to address early on organizers, and I use the term organizer largely to distinguish, eventually you want to make them into mobilizers and champions, but they usually don't start that way. And sometimes they're decision makers, they may be potential sponsors, key recommenders. Often they sort of start in an interaction with sales as a project manager for a buying process. But as you're looking at them as specific stakeholders from the sales side, it's thinking about how do you connect and qualify them? Are they really going to organize and help you drive a process? You're really looking to differentiate because you're trying to eventually get to a business case to buy for the organization with them. And you're certainly looking to motivate them, giving them courage, converting them into being a champion or an internal mobilizer at the account is all important. But they're not the only stakeholders that commercial teams deal with. And as they're talking to increasingly political organizations, they have to deal with a number of influencers as well, where those influencers have all kinds of interests. So focusing them on what should be important to them matters. Motivating those influencers and getting more advocates there can be helpful. Some of those influencers are a potential threat. And so defusing that threat, satisfying them on challenges is important. And with influencers, you really have to do something slightly different. It's the cat herding part of the sales process, where pre-sales professionals and professionals are really just trying to provide enough information and from the process of dealing with a variety of stakeholders to identify more champions to provide more support to key recommenders and sponsors. Last and certainly not least, there are the gatekeepers. And we know that procurement, legal, IT, and others are of that character. Connecting with their innate risk aversion is one of the ways to use value with them. But the most important way is to have a good internal business case shared with an organizer or a champion before you get to the gatekeepers. That internal business case then helps provide leverage in the negotiation, helps provide confidence in the negotiation, and helps negotiate based on value and not just price. So value propositions are specific buyer enablement content for account-based marketing and account-based selling. Let's look at how they are ABS and ABM tools. They're helpful because a value proposition helps enable a buyer understand why buy your solution, how do I as a buyer benefit. They're specific in helping that buyer realize what do your benefits mean to the buyer? What is the buyer's specific business case to buy? They're relevant in terms of how does your solution fit the buyer's needs and the buyer's business? And they're buyer enabling because it helps the buyer realize why they might want to pay a premium price for your solution. And finally, the best value propositions are robust. They help with prove it. We all know how buyers view their businesses as different. We all know how buyers are skeptical in looking at when will your solution actually deliver results for that buyer, manage that buyer's expectations. They're robust in terms of helping with the what ifs. Will that buyer's business still achieve meaningful results? So what we're going to do in the remainder of the webinar is illustrate with some concrete examples of account-specific and stakeholder-specific value propositions. And we're going to do that across a variety of industries to try and give you a sense as to how you can focus the specificity in the way you build your content. So looking at the examples, of course, as we look at value propositions, we're always looking at decisions because value propositions are about decisions to buy. And whether those are decisions about how to use your solution, how to use it first, timing, implementation, what are the comparators and reference alternatives, direct choices among offerings. We'll look at a number of examples of those. Problems and objectives, we'll consider those. And again, that's where we get not only overall organizational objectives, overall organization problems and pain points, but ones that may resonate more specifically for stakeholders. And then finally, on identity and business, we'll look at some specificity there. So let's move to an example. And I'm going to start my examples off with an example that's a fintech type example. It's a software offering for use by financial services companies. And it's software and it's heavy services. And we'll start to look at how a value proposition can be used that relates to an offering that's about improving trading compliance in a financial services firm. And so you begin to see this is an early part of the story, early in the sales cycle, where we're trying to draw the buyer audience to the nature of the problem. We're trying to begin to identify what might resonate specifically with them. Because here are the three things or the three differentiators that our solution provides. Our solution provides more efficient compliance, and that's just cost. It's about risk reduction, and it's about employee retention. And you're never quite sure which of those will resonate best. So early on, you may be emphasizing all three, but getting ready to drill down on what matters most. And early on, drawing their attention to this by telling a good story about another customer similar to them is a great approach to talking value early. So here we see a case study where Tracom, the software, was implemented and the client achieved results. And you see the results in a very simple financial form. You see the assumptions of them. And maybe you've drawn this particular buyer to the point where they're starting to ask questions based on their own content. And you already are set up so that if they ask the question that really gets to some of their specifics, you've got changeable numbers. You've got an ability to go in and begin to customize for them. So maybe I'm in a situation where I'm talking about a bigger firm, and whoops, I think I did smaller, add a 0. But I'm beginning to engage them specifically. Now, I might want to do that here when I'm talking about the case study, where there's always the opportunity early on to have a direct ROI calculator, just to get it a reason to move forward. And here we're doing a little bit more, but very simple customizing. And so as I do that, I've got their employers, their employees. I may have an average cost to replace employees. And as I do that, whoops, 400,000. I'm having a hard time with zeros today. But I'm changing this and I'm customizing it. And as I do, I'm probably not going much deeper than this on an early call. But I do want to have it available to me as specific content where I can take it further later. And I may be taking it further later with some of my colleagues along with me. So there may be, for that later call, a different look and different content, but that is still that specific to that buyer. And in that case, we may be reiterating some of the same messages. We may now be trying to understand what resonates for them. So here we're into their problems. We're starting to identify, maybe with a specific stakeholder, maybe you're talking to a compliance person, and you know employee retention may not be as important. Or maybe you still do want to emphasize it because that's going to be your sponsor, and you know that they're going to need to win over other members of their team. So think of this as what's going to matter to that stakeholder as well as what matters to the organization. Because I get into any specific value driver or any specific area where I'm differentiated, I'm going to have good, clear, crisp messages. And here I've got a little bit of quantification. You know, did you realize that per employee administrative costs are pretty high? But I also have the ability now to customize for them a little bit more. And so as I begin to do that, you know, perhaps I'm actually getting some of their operating costs if I'm talking to a compliance officer. And they're willing to give me what some of their direct numbers are. So I'm already making this very specific, and I'm doing it based on their data and their operating parameters. And so as I move through this story, I've got my other value drivers, I've got my other content, and perhaps at the end, I've got a simple value summary. Independent of the price of my offering, this gives them a reason to sort of move things forward, a fundamental sense that this could be worth $14 million a year for them. And as we move forward, we consider some of the other elements of this particular value proposition, because I know downstream as I look at this, I may well be getting into pricing as we get to a business case to buy. And so here in the business case, I'm re-emphasizing some of the underlying points, but I may also be looking at pricing. And we know pricing gets very specific, where the particular software might be offered on more than one pricing model. Here we've got seat-based pricing and transaction-based pricing. They're showing side by side. So we could actually look at them and make those comparisons. But I may also have differences in the service offerings. And this is one of those classic cases where you've got gold, silver, bronze in terms of services, good, better, best, if you've seen some of Rafi Mohammed's recent work in Harvard Business Review. As I'm considering those alternatives, I want to include those. And I'm including those not just in price, but there may be different risk impacts as I'm doing that, where I'm talking about a better, more comprehensive set of services, reducing the risk further and talking to value that way. Because as I'm rolling the pricing and the customized pricing in, I'm then getting to a bottom line. It's what's the value of this to the customer. So that's the first example. Let's now go to an example from healthcare. And in this case, we're going to look at a healthcare product, a drug that was launched a number of years ago. I was on the launch team for this. And I think the interesting thing, and this one is a little bit more of a pure calculator, but I think it gets very directly at this question of how can you take the data that you already have and use that data to make conversations and quantification specific in a way that's easy for your account teams. So what are the data you might have? In healthcare, there's a lot of data on different customer accounts. So for example, in this case, this is a hospital product. And what I want to be able to do is very quickly take a general value proposition, a case study, and make it specific to the account I'm calling on today. So in this case, I'm looking at calling on Mass General. And this time, by the way, you'll see the changes I've made highlighted as we go. And so as I'm starting to get into what's going to be my storyline for Mass General on this drug, it's a procedural anticoagulant used in angioplasty, I do start to get into their specifics. And you can see I've already begun to have an account-specific value proposition. And I can do that with account-specific data. If I don't have account-specific data, I may have good regional data. And so in this case, for example, I may know that there are certain reimbursement rates that apply in different geographies, and I'm grabbing those. Or I may see and understand that some of the benchmarks are really different depending on what kind of institution it is. So here I have an academic medical center, and that applies to Mass General. But if I were at my community hospital, I might instead grab some benchmarks for that. And as I do this, as you see, I've begun to customize it further. In doing that also, I have sources of support. So those support, some of that support may just be on data, a pop open where you're seeing the data. Or some of the support may actually be information on the product. So in all pharmaceutical products, you've got prescribing information, and you have to as a regulatory matter. Or I might actually have underlying studies and support I want to get at in a very quick and easy way to go deeper onto the clinical side as to the value the product delivers. But let's go further into how to make this specific, because now, to our earlier point, there may be very different practices for entities that are serving patients primarily on an inpatient basis versus outpatient, or there may be differences in reimbursement. There may be really distinct differences here in terms of what am I actually selling. And with drugs, you have different packages. You may be selling large or small vials. You may be selling in different pack sizes. And all of those may be affecting the price, even though they may not be affecting the value. So that by the time I've gone through just a few simple things, and I don't have to do all this at once, I have what begins to be a very specific value proposition. And here you see it qualitatively. But here you see it in terms of the value created specifically for the account. And you see it at the end in terms of a bottom line, in terms of what for that account it can mean with their number of procedures and their costs of serving patients. So, third example I want to touch on is really related to just because, so let's start this one off. This is a cloud infrastructure platform. And just because you can be specific doesn't mean you have to be. And I know there's a tendency with some to say, I've got to get all the account data right first. But design your value proposition so you can have those early conversations without the data. This is for cloud infrastructure, and I might be calling on a specific account. We'll come to that. But it's designed to tell a story. It's designed to identify what resonates with the customers. Here it's designed to help them rethink what their problem might be, as well as to provide some data from benchmark surveys about what other people find to be their problem. And using the case study, then you start to get into a reasonable basis for storytelling. So that for the case study, you may well have a good value delivered. And by the time you're there, you may start to be modifying this. So I know I'm going to call on Midwest Heavy Equipment. I'm not sure that's a real company. And what I'm already seeing is an ability to begin to modify this for them, where they may have 5,000 users, 60 applications, and as I'm modifying it, as I'm customizing it, I'm getting through to a solution that will work for them. But I already have my ROI calculator going, and it's there if I want to use it. But just as importantly, it's here as I move forward and come back. And as I do that, I may want to go a little bit deeper in doing my call prep this time around. So as I think about good call prep, what I probably want to have is a good set of places to just think through, okay, what are the primary drivers for this account in terms of what the value created might be. And so early on, I grabbed some data on their IT users and applications, but maybe later on in the process, I've learned more about their IT staff and how many they have. So they're actually IT staff heavy. And as I do this, I'm really beginning to get more deeply into how they're looking at it, how they're thinking about it. I've identified they have a longer planning horizon because they don't think about these things too often. And again, as I get ready for that next call, then I'm moving in to have a deeper value conversation. And as I do that, for example, I look at, and I'm going to jump straight to a business case to buy, where with that specific case, I can drill down, see what their pricing is, and maybe make some relevant changes for their pricing, but also have a good visual on what the value we create from the status quo is. And so having done all that, what's interesting here is my reference comparison was the status quo. Well, next year when I come back for the renewal, that's no longer going to be the reference because they've already implemented it. And I may want to tell a completely different story then. And what I probably will also be concerned about, at least in advance, is they may be comparing me to a competitor. So here's a little bit more about the decision they made last year. What resonated? Why did they do it? And here's the value that we talked about and that we talked about delivering to them. Here was our pricing. So that now as I'm thinking about this year, I may want to have a different perspective. And that perspective is that they're a current customer. So that as I really understand this, now I'm comparing myself to the cost of, and cost of switching is now a reason for them to stay with me. And it turns out that I'm actually a lot better than my competitors in terms of downtime. And so I really want to emphasize that in a competitive situation. And having that ability and that flexibility to both draw on the previous conversations and pull in new reference data is important. So one final example really comes down to this situation where you may have complex configurations. Here's an HVAC example, so heavy equipment, where you may be selling to a specific customer, and here again, this time you're going to see who is it I'm talking to. And there may be a lot of choices in configuration. So they may only be buying a heating system or a full system or air conditioning only. I'll stick with a full system. And there may be, along their choices, they may be picking between models and even types. So they're looking at a furnace rather than a boiler. And in doing that, there are only some heat distribution systems that make sense. And then I want to be able to talk about a specific air conditioning system. And in doing that, I may be looking at including a service contract or not. I want to do some simple math on their facility size and trying to get to a value proposition quickly. We're having just done that. I've got pricing for the heating system here and a direct comparison with a competitor. I've got AC pricing. I've got some net value being shown. I've got each of my value drivers with greater detail. In this case, I even have a total cost of ownership graph. So all examples of how we can get specific and how we can turn good general content into account-based selling and account-based marketing content. So with that, let's go back to the slides. And as you look at account-based selling, as you look at account-based selling versus value propositions, it's important to realize it delivers results. We find our own customers report that when they use a value proposition, they get higher close rates and higher prices. There's some reasons for that, and the reasons are about account-based selling improving sales outcomes. There's some great work, and this is not survey work, it's analysis work that Gong has done based on over 1 million sales calls. If you haven't seen this piece, it's really very interesting, where one of their findings, and they're comparing star reps versus average performers in this very large database, but star reps spend 52% more of their time talking about value-related subjects than average performers. And in doing that, they're talking value broadly. They're talking ROI. They're talking pain points. They're talking business challenges. They're talking project agenda. The Gong survey shows that a single call with more than one participant is 258% more likely to close a deal than reps flying solo. And that's really about teams together delivering relevant expertise, telling the buyer they're important. And those teams prepare for those meetings best when they get together and focus on buyer value before the meeting. Address the competition. Discussing the competition early versus later never makes it 49% likelier that a deal will close. A value proposition facilitates that discussion. And doing that early and talking about the reference alternative early helps influence the prospect early. By the time they get to the yes, they really have forgotten about the competition. And most important, and I think all good salespeople know this, listen. Star reps talk 46% of the time on this million database of recordings, versus average reps talking 68% of the time during the recordings. Why do that? Well, it should be pretty obvious that you're getting valuable information from the account, that the more they talk, the better you're going to connect with them. Talking too much creates the problem of rambling. So you want to avoid rambling. You want to avoid talking yourself out of the deal. So account-based marketing, account-based selling enable customer-specific pricing as well. It's interesting when you go to the pricing professionals, you find that the holy grail of pricing is pricing segmentation. The best segmentation, and this is Rafi Muhammad again, is based on value, where good, better, best solutions help address this sort of how do you generate the best value for that specific customer, and customized pricing helps you go after that. So we finally have the technology available with account-based marketing and account-based selling to facilitate genuine customer-specific pricing. And that's what's new, is that pricing professionals can actually tag on to account-based marketing and account-based selling and implement agendas in terms of better pricing, where they're actually coming up with better segmentation design because of better information. It facilitates the execution of that segmented pricing, and it enables refinement of pricing strategies. So how do you get started on ABM and ABS and account-specific value propositions? Well, quantified value for one account type. Specific quantification highlights relevant messages, how you want to tell a useful story, and key business parameters that are account specific. But as you're doing that, you want to track other account types, because some of the differences between accounts may or may not be important, and you want to identify the relevant differences. Because as your value proposition matures, you want to embed flexibility in that value proposition to be more and more customer specific. That's going to help you also identify offering alternatives and better customizations. Finally, what's most important is that you keep testing and refining. So test specific value propositions, refine your base case, scale flexibly, test your segmented offerings and pricing. See what you learn from the data about value. And doing all that makes it possible to continue to refine those strategies. The reality is great B2B enterprises no longer sell product features. They enable buyers to obtain better business outcomes. Value propositions create moments when buyers realize those outcomes. And if you can't explain it simply, you really don't understand it well enough. Because value propositions support clear, consistent collaboration between sales teams and enabled buying teams. Taylor?
Great, Peyton. Thank you so much for sharing those insights. We've had a couple questions come in during the webinar, and there is still time to enter your question into the panel on your screen. While you're entering, a reminder to complete that 10-second survey while exiting today's webinar to receive a copy of value propositions for your customer audience and be entered into a raffle giving away 3 free copies of Dollarizing Differentiation Value. We really appreciate your interest in LeveragePoint, and if you'd like to learn more or see a personalized value proposition, just check the appropriate box in the exit survey. All right, we've had a couple more come in. To answer the most popular one myself, as always, yes, this webinar is recorded and the slides and recording will be emailed to you within 2 business days. Okay, Peyton, first real question. So we talk to multiple stakeholders within a single deal. How do you or can you transform a value proposition to be useful in every single conversation?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Stakeholders are so important. Even though we talk about account-based marketing and account-based selling, it's also stakeholder-based marketing and stakeholder-based selling. And so what we know is very important on the sales side is identifying sponsors, organizers, champions. And what we also know is other people can support a deal or they can undermine it. So it's really important to have your overall value proposition available. Now, that doesn't mean presenting it all the way through to everybody or even anybody, because stakeholder-specific selling is about identifying what's most important to the stakeholder you're in front of and really focusing on that conversation. it's good that they understand that your value is important to other members of their team, because that's about building momentum in the consensus. But targeting in what matters to them, focusing the conversation on that is really critical. So I would say use the content, but focus the conversation on what matters to who you're talking to.
Absolutely. All right, next one for you. I'm at an organization where the marketing team is talking about ABM, account-based marketing, all the time, but not doing anything for sales. Is account-based selling actually realistic?
Interesting question. You know, sometimes when you see these themes of buyer enablement, you see them with the theme of we're going to be agnostic with respect to the channel we use. You know, is it online? Is it digital where there's no touch by sales? Or is sales just one of many channels? And I think, you know, look, for some consumer goods, for a lot of things going on in retailing, the importance of sales is clearly declining. The information is there. With complex solutions, though, that's not the case. And complex solutions, we still don't have the AI tools to make it possible to sell complex solutions without the best sales professionals actually interacting in a human form, in understanding the politics of a given buyer, in customizing a solution, in guiding them to where to start. So account-based marketing isn't going to work for complex solutions unless the organization is also focused on account-based selling. How is marketing going to execute without extending that content to make it useful for sales?
Great. Next one for you. I don't think my sales guys are going to get this. What's your experience in other companies?
I take it that's not coming from a VP of sales, or it could be, but maybe there's time for some career counseling there. You know, what I think is really interesting if you're looking at sales from the outside is you may have some strange impressions. If you actually get involved with some of your best salespeople and you see what they're doing, it's surprising how often you'll find a few salespeople actually are doing value selling as it is. The number of good sales spreadsheets that we come across at accounts we work with and how valuable they are in thinking about the best content for everyone is huge. So first, don't count on it. You probably have some good value selling going on as it is. But the interesting thing then is, how do you make that contagious? And I think there are a couple approaches to that. One approach is to leverage your best pre-sales people. So value selling works very well in this evaluation phase. And you're talking about people who are already subject matter experts if your pre-sales people are involved in the evaluation stage. So get good value tools, good value selling practices going with your pre-sales team. But that's really not enough, because the most impactful value selling is value selling that starts early. It starts before pre-sales people are involved, and the surveys that show that are huge. So it's really critical as you make this part of your organization. First, you need to pick important products, and you need to have good value propositions for those products. You do need sales leadership engagement, because sales leaders help drive making value contagious, and they also help identify and incentivize a mobilizer. And having a mobilizer within sales is really important, where one person is genuinely helping people from the product side or the marketing side test the usefulness of the tools they're providing, help provide feedback, help make them better and better. And that mobilizer also is the key to coaching other salespeople and providing intensive coaching as other salespeople get involved. The key to making this happen is early success. And that early success, well broadcast by sales leaders, then creates a trend. So the final element as you get there is good sales training. And guess what? Organizations are investing huge amount in sales training initiatives. And so many of those initiatives talk about value propositions and value selling. But those don't really work unless you provide sales with the tools.
Yeah, absolutely. And the final question we have here is actually on the dollarizing book that we're giving away. So the title of that book is Dollarizing Differentiation Value. And that's written by our partner and good friend, Stefan Liozu, and that can be purchased on Amazon. But again, we're also giving away 3 free copies if you fill out that survey upon exiting today's webinar. So be sure to do that as well. But that looks like it's it for today. So thank you all for taking the time to join us, and a special thank you to Peyton for your insights. And from all of us here at LeveragePoint, we hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Take care.